Hello, welcome to Stories in Time. My name is Ellouise Schoettler. I'm your storyteller. Today I'm going to tell a story that I love to tell. And it's one of the powers of storytelling. Because when you step back into a story that you lived a long time ago, you go right back into that happy time. And this is a happy time for me. It's called Aunt Annie's Baby. When I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, Annie Gross was 68 years old. And she was always the oldest woman I knew as long as she lived and I was alive. I never caught up with her. And she was wonderful. She was different. She was wonderful. She was tall. She stood up straight when she walked. She had a top knot on her hair on the top of her head. And she just always was in charge. That was the interesting thing about her. She lived with her sister, her younger sister, who had had polio when she was a young girl. And so Aunt Kate was rather crippled. And when I'd come to the door of their house and knock on it or ring the bell, I could see Aunt Kate lurch out of her chair, knowing that there was somebody right there to see them, and she had something in mind. Now, when I first started going to their house, they lived downtown in Charlotte on Church Street, and it was a big two-story house with a big attic that made the third floor. And it had been built in the, what would that be, the 1870s by their mother and father. And when they died, they stayed in the house. And Annie worked downtown. She was a milliner at Ivy's department store. She made beautiful hats for people to look just gorgeous when they were out on the street. Aunt Kate had blue eyes, beautiful shining blue eyes, and blonde hair, which she also wore pulled back, sometimes with a knot on the top of her hair. And they were so much fun to be with. They had this big house down there with a narrow lot, and the back of that house was a long, narrow yard that went quite far back. And they grew their vegetables out there. And they had fruit trees and berries on vines. And, well, it was just for a child to go out into that backyard was just plain fun. But the best thing in that house, in my opinion, was in the kitchen. And it was the wood stove that their mother had cooked on as long as they lived there. And from that stove, those two women made fantastically delicious bread. It came out every other day, 2 or 3 loaves, perfectly browned loaves. And when they looked at you and said, "Would you like to have a piece of bread?" Well, everybody in the family, not just children, everybody in the family that was offered a piece of their bread stood up and held their hands out. And they would put butter on and homemade jelly. There's nothing that really matches that. I hope you've had that. I still think of it. Well, they grew older. They had to move from that house, and so they moved into a smaller house out near my grandmother. Now, that was really quite nice for me. By that time, I was in junior high school. And when I walked home from junior high school, I was only 2 or 3 blocks from them. And every so often, when I had an urge for a piece of their bread, I would detour and stop in to see them. That's when I'd ring the bell, and Aunt Annie would come to the door, and behind her I would see Aunt Kate lurching out of a rocking chair and headed off toward the kitchen. And I knew that it would only be a few minutes until I had my piece of bread. We'd talk about what they knew about in the neighborhood, and I'd tell them anything that I'd heard about in the neighborhood or in the family. Some afternoons, we brought out the Pachisi set and put it on the black mahogany dining room table in their teeny tiny dining room. But they kept that big table of their mama's, even though it almost filled up the room. And we played Pachisi. Or if I knew or sensed that they were in a really good mood, I might say, "Aunt Annie, can't you tell me the story of the baby?" Eloise, you know that story, my dear. Well, I know I do, but it's so wonderful when you tell it. Won't you please? And Kate would say, "Annie, just go ahead, tell the child the story." Well, I've told it to her before. Why should I tell it to her again? Just don't be so difficult. Tell her the story. And then she'd say, "Well, oh, all right, I do it well, don't I?" And she did. She started off by telling us of one evening, late afternoon, when it was beginning to get dark. It was in October. It was beginning to get dark earlier, and they were back in the kitchen with their mama, helping to fix supper, set the table, get out things that she needed, when all of a sudden, knack, 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 there was a huge, loud knocking on the front door, and I ran to see who was there, and it was the Dolan boy from down the street. "I need Miss Gross. I need Miss Gross, Miss Annie, the one who helps with babies." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, she's cooking our supper. She can't be bothered with that." I said, "I need her. My mama needs her." And I ran back into the kitchen, and she was already coming. She had heard him. And Aunt Annie was one of those women that goes and helps other women when they're having a baby. She talked to him a minute, and then she reached down and she was picking up her bag. She always kept a bag near the door in case she was needed. And she had a shawl that she put around. It was a little cool. She had a shawl that she put around it. I went up to her and I said, "Please, please, Mama, please, let us go with you tonight. We want to be there too. It's only a block and a half down the street. No, I don't really take my girls. Please, Mama, just this." And Kate came and she said, "Oh, yes, I want to go too." And she nodded as she was stepping out the door, and she said, "Oh, all right, but you have to be quiet. You have to stay on the front porch. There's big business going on in the house." And she started off down the steps and then out onto the sidewalk and then down the street, and she was moving fast to get to the house. And we ran after her. We had pulled down 2 other shawls, and we were running after her. She came down 2 blocks, and the house was surrounded by a fence. And at the sidewalk that worked up to the front porch, there was a gate, and she stopped there and opened the gate and stepped in and walked up to the house, 4 steps up to the porch. She went over to the front door, knocked, and somebody said, "Come in." And she pulled open the door and went inside. Then she stuck her head back out, and she said, "You sit over there on that swing and wait for me." And that's, of course, what we did. We sat down and we swam. We were moving the swing back and forth just a little bit. Didn't make any noise, really. Looking around, it was getting darker. I can remember that, just getting darker. And inside the house, there was a window there. And we were sitting close to it. And we could hear the noise that was going on in that house. Why, Mrs. Nolan was screaming. She was making all sorts of noise. "Oh, oh!" Kate reached out and grabbed my hand. You did that. You remember that? You reached out, you grabbed my hand. And we sat there in the swing, holding hands, listening and wondering when the baby would come. It was a long time. And then there was a squeaky little sound of a baby. Just a squeaky little sound. It's the baby's here. Wonder what it is. Is it a girl or is it a boy? The baby's here. And then there was no sound. There was not another sound. Isn't it supposed to keep crying? Kate asked me that. Isn't it supposed to keep crying? Well, yes, it's supposed to keep crying. Well, this one's not crying. And we waited, and we waited. And then Mama came out of the house. She came over to the swing. And she said, we won't be long now. We're going to go home. This is a very sad day in this house. Very sad. Why? Why is it a very sad day? I heard the baby. The baby did cry, just that one cry, and then it died. And there was no more sound from that baby. And we thought that we'd be able to take care of his mother and that she would be all right. But she wasn't all right, and she's gone too. So she went back in the house. And Kate and I didn't talk very much to each other. We were just sitting there. And all of a sudden, in front of us, out of the door to the house, stepped a tall woman in a long dress that touched the floor. It looked like a nightgown. It did. It looked like a nightgown. And she stood there, just hovering at the door. Do you see that? Shh. Yes, I see that. And then she started down to go to the sidewalk. But then she came back. And she waited. And then she went back in. And she came back. And she was holding her baby. That's Mrs. Dolan. That's Mrs. Dolan. She came back to get her baby. That's who that is. And we sat there, whispered and watched. And she went down the steps and down the sidewalk, opened that gate, and then she turned and she walked away. It wasn't too long until Mama came out. She came over to the swing. All right, girls, we can go now. Mama, Mrs. Dolan came back to get her baby. We won't have any of that kind of talk. I don't believe in it. We won't have that. I will not listen to that. And she walked down the steps and out the sidewalk and opened the gate, and she left, and she was really walking fast. And we walked as fast as we could to catch up. She never would let us tell her that we saw the mother, Mrs. Nolan, come back to get her baby. But we did see that, didn't we, Annie? Yeah, Kate, we saw it. We saw it. And we know it. We know what happened. We know what happened. Thank you for coming, Ellouise. I really like it when you ask me to tell that story, honey. You can come back anytime. I might not always want to tell it, but when I do tell it, it makes me happy to remember that day in October on Church Street.